Hello and welcome to the latest course by Presenting the Past. This one is all about an introduction to the architecture found on the Isle of Axholme. Now, before starting, whilst not essential in order to get the most out of this online course, we do recommend that you have a pen and piece of paper to hand. Now, this isn't essential, it's just that you can make some notes as you go through should you wish. It is only if you wish. There is not going to be a test at the end of this or anything. It's just if you want to make a few notes and keep a few facts that we are slinging at you to mind. Now, of course, this being online, you can pause this at any time. However, there is also a suggested breakpoint halfway through. Even if you don't feel you need a break, I do suggest you take that moment to just step away from the screen and walk about the room, maybe get yourself a cup of tea or coffee, just to give yourself a break and help you to refocus for the second half. Now, this course aims to give you an introduction to the different architecture styles on the Isle. This is not going to be in depth, and we're going to structure it by going chronologically, broadly speaking. Where I can, I'll be going chronological. I may flip between a little bit if it's appropriate, but we will try and be as logical as possible. At the end of this course, you should be able to identify some key periods of building design and have a better appreciation for the unique character on the Isle of Axholme. And we're going to finish by just looking at some of the challenges in how we interpret, reuse or restore historic buildings. Now, if you've seen the other courses, you'll know that I do like to start by just looking at where this project has come from. Now, this is part of the Isle of Axholme and Hatfield Chase Landscape Partnership. Now, this is a partnership that is being run through North Lincolnshire Council and is being funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And this is a broad project which is aimed at helping people to reconnect and engage with their local environment. Now, it's such a big project that it is then subdivided into 16 smaller projects, of which ours, Presenting the Past, is just one. Now, Presenting the Past is mainly focused on helping people to understand the history, heritage of their area in 3 parishes. We are exploring Belton, Ouston Ferry and Haxey. And we've been working in those areas, learning from people what they want to understand, what they want to explore, and the skills they want to learn. And this course has been developed as part of that consultation process. This is one of the skills people would like to develop. Our project, Presenting the Past, is being run by the charity Heritage Lincolnshire. Now, Heritage Lincolnshire is a charity who works to conserve the heritage of the county. We deliver activities for people to learn about it, to gain new skills and to get involved. We genuinely believe that our work makes Lincolnshire a better place to work in and to visit and to live in. And our cultural activities help to enrich people's lives as well as celebrating this fantastic county. So if you've ever gone to a Heritage Open Day in Lincolnshire, we are involved in organising that. We have our own commercial archaeology team who go out and actually dig in the ground and find more stuff that we can shout about. We deliver courses to volunteers, we get people out on site, we run community excavations and field walking projects. And as a building preservation trust, we also have a building restoration project ongoing at any one time as well. We're currently just finishing up our current project of the Old King's Head, which is going to be a fantastic cafe and deli with a B&B facility down near Boston. So if you're ever visiting down there, I can recommend that as a place to stay. And we're just starting our new project, which is looking at Greyfriars in Lincoln and how we can bring people into that space again. And who am I? My name is Lydia Hendry. I'm a community archaeologist with Heritage Lincolnshire. And I don't have a background in buildings. I am, as I said, I'm an archaeologist by trade. However, by working at Heritage Lincolnshire with a lot of big experts in buildings, I've learned so much. And so this course has been developed in collaboration with Matt Bentley, who is our conservation project manager. And together we have developed this course, and we're going to be hopefully using it to really show the unique character of the Isle of Axholme. So without further ado, let's get started. Now, this map comes from a historical atlas of Lincolnshire, and I think it's really useful in just showing how the Isle of Axholme sits. So we can see the Isle of Axholme is just up here. We've got the Wolds coming down here, and we've got this lovely limestone ridge, then coming all the way down through Lincoln, all the way down to the bottom. Now, most buildings, if we're talking about the more historic periods, not so much the modern day, are built of local materials. And so it's important to understand what is available locally, because that will help us interpret the local variations we see in buildings. Now, like I said, we have this lovely limestone ridge that isn't too far away from Axholme, and there are lots and lots of stone buildings along this. But the earth under the Isle is not so kind. And if we just have a look around the Isle, if you're living there, just go for a wander, you might not notice as many stone buildings in the area. Instead, there's a much higher concentration of brick buildings, and historically there would have been timber and mud buildings as well. And indeed, some of these may actually still be in situ, but are now covered up with bricks, so they've been buried underneath later changes. Now, unfortunately, because these older materials of timber and mud are, of course, not going to last as long as stone, this does mean that we don't have as many examples of older buildings on the Isle. Most of them have likely been lost. And so the most significant building in every village in the Isle of Axholme is going to be the church, because that is the building, even way back when, it was built of stone, because it was such an important building in the community. So a church is a really great place to start when we're looking at older buildings in the area. And so we're going to start with the Anglo-Saxon period. Now, the Anglo-Saxon period, the only remnants we're going to have from then is going to be churches, with the exception of a handful of Roman bits. And they're mainly found around Lincoln itself. Anglo-Saxon is where our earliest standing remains in Lincolnshire are. Now, these can often be identified as very squat square towers with double belfry windows. Now, a lot of the time, these churches are actually built after the Norman conquest, but they retain a lot of these earlier characteristics, so they're more in the Anglo-Saxon style. Now, originally in the Anglo-Saxon period, the building of churches may have been as simple as dedicating an existing timber hall to Christian worship. However, as time went on and bishops had their influence, they wanted to get more grand buildings into Britain. And so they were importing across skills from France, which included the skill of building in stone, plastering, glazing windows, and tiling roofs. And so we start to see more and more stone-built buildings in this time. These churches are sometimes, we consider them quite narrow. You can see windows such as these, very, very narrow windows. There we go. And so if you've got to think about it, going into that space, it would have been quite dark. It would have been quite a still space and probably would have felt quite atmospheric. There is some evidence to say that they were fairly richly decorated inside. So think paintings or embroidery hangings. And sometimes, if we're really lucky, when we look closely at Anglo-Saxon churches, if you have a look at the stone in them, you can sometimes see engravings and markings that shows the stone has been reused from Roman periods. So there was a bit of reuse going on as well. So this is where we're starting. Fairly simple, normally just one or two spaces within it, a dark space, but quite atmospheric at the same time. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't get a better scan of this at the time, but I do just quickly want to talk about this. This is a drawing of the floor plan of St. Peter's Church at Barton on Humber. And I think, did I have an image in that before? I'm not sure. And this is really what I'm saying about Anglo-Saxon churches, about how they're still there, but they've often been changed. So this dark outline here, this is the outline of the original Anglo-Saxon church. So the original church was just 3 cells. We have the baptistry over here, we have the tower or the nave over here, and the chancel here. Then in the mid to late 11th century, the old chancel was demolished. There we go, old chancel was demolished, and it was expanded out here with a new nave, a new chancel and an apse. And then as we go through time, you can see all the different time periods here. We're not going to go through all of them now. It's expanded again and again and again. Excuse me. And so that does just show how the Anglo-Saxon church, often still in churches, but it is a starting point. It's a starting point for our villages. It's a starting point for our architecture. Now, you might question why people were putting so much effort into building their churches out of stone, when, of course, their houses were being built out of wood and mud still. Why is there this difference? Now, stone was seen as a better building material, of course, because it's much more long-standing. It's a lot more expensive and it's a lot harder to build with as well. Think of the difficulty of moving stones into place as compared to timber. However, what we have to remember is the place of religion had in people's lives back then. Life in the Anglo-Saxon period probably wasn't a long life, and especially once we get into the Norman period and the medieval periods, it would have been quite difficult. Famine would not have been uncommon, disease would not have been uncommon. I'm sure there were lovely bits too, but your life was not guaranteed, perhaps the same way that we see having a long life today. And so having a religion which talks about having an afterlife is very, very powerful in people's lives. And when you get parish priests telling people, oh, if you give your money to the church and your time to the church and we can build a better church, that will secure you a better afterlife. You might well see it as better to invest in your afterlife than it is to invest in your mortal life. So people are investing a lot more time, energy, effort, money into their churches because religion is having such a more, is having perhaps a more profound impact on people's lives than we see in society as a whole today. Now, this is just an image taken from Google Maps, and it just is showing some lumps and bumps. Now, we don't have much more evidence of Anglo-Saxon architecture in the Isle of Axholme, and this isn't really architecture, so perhaps I'm going off track a little bit here, but these lumps and bumps are evidence of towns and settlements. So we know people were living here, they didn't just have churches here as well. And so we move on to the Norman period, or as is sometimes referred to as the Romanesque period when we look at architecture. Now, having started with this very, very simple form of church architecture that we see in the Anglo-Saxon period, things are going to start becoming more elaborate. So we start seeing things, decoration, such as zigzag chevrons. Churches start including an apse more. So where's my mouse? There we go. So an apse is these recesses at the end. This is a domed one here. You'll get stone vaulting. The walls we often see become thicker, which allows them to build up higher. So we're looking at more height in the buildings. And buttresses are also used. You can just see underneath the words here, once again, to add support to these higher levels. There you go, you've got some examples of things here. Now, there isn't a huge amount of Roman or Romanesque on the Isle, but I still want to cover this, as you can still find this in quite a few places and is an important part of architecture history. We tend to see it dating to the 10th to the 12th century in the UK. And the key things to look out for are these quite thick walls and rounded archways. So you can see a lovely round archway here and here. And sometimes you do get this chevron carving, and you can see here it's really deep as well. So very, very clear chevrons detailing. Having a look around Haxey Church on the Isle of Axholme, it does have some 12th century sections to the nave arcade. Now, for as impressive as these walls look, often what you'll find is that the centre of the walls is a rubble infill. So you've got the nice two sides of the wall, then inside that is infilled with rubble. Masonry can be a little bit rough in places, especially where the very easily worked limestone is available. But of course, as we know, limestone wears down a bit easier as well. And of course, Lincolnshire, that lovely limestone ridge, means we do get a lot of this architecture around. Columns in buildings, and we do get a lot of columns, especially in churches, they do tend to be structural. But this example from Durham Cathedral, you can see they've also been highly decorated as well. So once again, much more elaborate decoration going on. So buildings becoming more impressive perhaps to look at, and more decorated themselves rather than having decoration in them. I will also see gargoyles coming from this time period as well. So like I said, this example here is Durham Cathedral, and this one here is Lincoln Castle. But as I said, not too many examples from the Isle of Axholme. But just to put things into context, this is actually from Lincoln, this image here. So in Lincoln, of course, we have stone available, but it tends to more go to those of who have a high status. It is a more expensive building material. Now, of course, things on this building have changed since it was built originally. Of course, the windows have changed since the Norman period. Up here, that brick chimney doesn't quite fit the rest of the house, and nor does the roof actually. So that's probably all changed as well. However, if we are looking at the shape of the windows and the doors, that's where we see the clue that this is a Norman building. So you can see once again, rounded archway, deep decoration, there we go, and for the windows as well. So these buildings can be hiding almost in our high streets, but they do have hints as to their true age. Now, these lines here, there we go, they've just put in the stone coursing. They are purely decorative. They're often used to denote where the floors are or to highlight detailing. So of course, in this case, it's drawing our eyes to these windows. And this is another example. So once again, you can see nice rounded doorways. And this is Boothby Pagnor Manor House. And once again, it's a high status building. But if you have a look at it and compare it to the last one, that's this picture here, there are quite a few differences. And one key difference is, if you'll notice, all the windows are upstairs. Everything down here are more entranceways, and of course you've got the stairs going to the upstairs up here. Now, this would have been a safety element. So you would have had your storage and your animals being kept downstairs and your fine rooms upstairs. There would have been ancillary buildings, but having this one structure that you could bring everything into, animals downstairs, people upstairs, means that if you need to retreat everything inside to a central point, you can. And of course, you can go up these steps, lock yourself away, and that's quite a nice defensive position as well. So this was a sturdy building which offered an amount of luxury because you still had your own space, and it would have definitely stood out as being a high status building. However, it achieved this while still being defensively strong. There's no way you can access this upper layer except through these steps. And of course, that makes it a really nicely defended position. And so we move on to the early English period. Now, this is approximately the 1200s, effectively. And it's when we start to see a change in arch shapes. Of course, before we're looking at the Norman period, there's very, very rounded arches. Now we're looking at arches with a point to them. So fashion's moving on, and pointy is what is popular now. There we go. So you can see this arch here. It's no longer completely rounded, but it has a point to it. These windows, once again, they have this point to them. There we go. And this remains almost universal for around 300 years. The Lancet Arch is the one that's most common between the 12th and the 13th centuries. We also get window traceries and these vaults as well. So once again, it's a sign that these big church buildings, they're not static, they're not stationary, they're continuing to develop and continuing to evolve and continuing to grow a lot of times as well. As time is going forward, more people are donating money to the church, which allows the church to expand again and again, which really is a good symbol of its power and influence over the local community. And so here are some examples here. You can see once again, lovely pointed archway. We've got more decoration happening, more elaborate decoration, perhaps in the stonework. It's not just chevrons anymore. And we've got vaults as well. You can see these beautiful ceilings. There we go. So moving up to the Isle, once again, not as many examples of this because we don't have as many building examples from this time period. We do have a little bit of Gothic architecture going on. And this change happens from around the 12th to the 16th centuries. Although sometimes this is also classed as Renaissance in the later period as well. So it's all kind of flowing into each other, these different periods. It's not cut and dried exactly when one starts and the other ends. But the big things we're looking for are these pointed archways, and these actually allow for higher structural loads. So it's more structurally sound, which means once again, you can build higher up. And so this allows the bigger spaces, and you'll notice these columns are a lot more slender than the ones at Durham Cathedral. If you can remember, those ones in the cathedral were absolutely huge. But because we're being a bit cleverer about how the structure's being carried, we don't need as thick columns. Still need support with buttressing. You can see this Lincoln Cathedral here, massive buttresses here, and they're just supporting all of this weight that is being carried there. The window traceries are becoming more elaborate, so we're seeing things like rose windows happenings, and we're seeing these elaborate carved scenes as well. So that's on my previous slide, more elaborate carvings going on as well. And so of course we've got an example of Lincoln Cathedral here. Belton Church is up here. And this is actually a great example of the vaulting and these skinnier columns coming down is from Greyfriars. You might remember Greyfriars when I mentioned it earlier. This is our latest building project. So we're going to be trying to get more people into this space. So keep your eyes peeled for that one. And so this is looking at the windows that I've been talking about as well. So medieval glass tends to come out really rich in colour. You can see these beautiful colours coming out here. It's predominantly actually stained glass, though, not coloured glass. And it's formed of lots and lots of small pieces within a lead frame. The difference with more 19th century glass tends to be that the later glass tends to be a little bit lighter. It uses a higher percentage of coloured glass. Both are very good and they are very worth looking after. And as you can see, these are absolutely stunning. And unfortunately, stained glass is one of those areas which can attract a bit of vandalism in modern day churches. And I mean, that one down there is absolutely gorgeous. And they can cause problems for churches because, of course, it's an expensive area to refurb. But it really shows that these churches weren't just these beige spaces, but would have been filled with colour, not just from the windows, but from other areas as well. There we go. And so they really, really add something to the church and how the church is being used and being seen in different periods. There we go. And so we move on to the perpendicular. Now this is more characterized by, it's been described as a somber or masculine feel, but basically what it means is these curved lines are being replaced by repetition. And it does tend to be a lot more somber. And for this, we need to look back to the context. So, of course, in this period, we have the Black Death. This kills off around a third of people on the planet. So this is huge. We have the 100 Years' War. And so there's this development of a national style, of the national identity. We get the introduction of the four-centred arch. So archways becoming more complex again. And we also get the introduction of more of a vertical emphasis with traceries running across the wall. Now, I think this example here is of Louth Church, and not quite in the Isle of Axholme, but not far away either. Now, the chancel and the nave were rebuilt between around 1430 and 1440. And the building of the tower, this bit over here, probably commenced around 10 years after that. And then work on the spire. Sorry, where's my mouse gone? Sorry, this is the tower here, and you've got the spire up here. And then work on the spire began in around 1501, and it wasn't finished until 1515. So the point that I'm trying to make here is, of course, the chancel and nave rebuilt between 1430 and, of course, to 1440, and the spire not finished until 1515. This would have been building projects that people did not see fully in their lifetime. And so it is the work of a community of generations continually plugging into their church, restoring it, building it bigger, building it higher and more elaborate. It was actually the tallest medieval spire in the UK. Another thing we see in this period is fan vaulting. So you can see the vaults. If you remember the previous ones, they were a lot more simple, whereas now they're coming up in this fan type effect. They are highly ornamental. So, of course, very, very, very pretty to look at. And they hide structural designs as well. So it's perhaps just hiding some of the more practical areas of building and turning it into these works of art instead. Now, St. Nicholas, which is Haxey Church, originates from the 12th to the 13th century, and it's mainly of a perpendicular Gothic style. So the tower is in 3 stages. You can see 1, 2, 3, with an embattled parapet at the top. So the piers of the North Arcade are Norman. So once again, we're looking at different time periods coming together to create a single church building. And the chancel and the chantry, the chapel, are mainly early English. So lots and lots of different time periods coming in one place in one building. And this is what makes church architecture so interesting, but sometimes so complex as well, because it is lots and lots and lots of different things coming together. It probably would actually be helpful at this moment to mention how to spot some of the later versions of these. So Belton All Saints Church, another good Isle of Axholme example, is showing a kind of a 14th to 15th century layout in the walls. And it has lots of internal evidence, including the nave arcades and octagonal pillars, which support this 14th to 15th century date. However, there is also a lot of 19th century restoration. I have to say here that restoration in the 19th century isn't exactly what we call restoration in the present day. It's more perhaps fanciful than what we aim for today. So most of the windows, that's these ones over here, and the roof, some of the internal plan and the layout has even been changed over time. And this is because the Victorians would often remodel or add aisles, change roofs, update windows in the name of restoration. Now, sometimes this was done very sensitively, as with St. Peter's Anglo-Saxon church in Barton on Humber. This retains a lot of its original features. However, more often than not, this was done terribly wrong and was very, very heavy-handed. There is an example of St. James Church in Louth, where James Fowler did so much restoration, or so-called restoration, that there is actually very, very little of the medieval church left now. So they were a little bit over-enthusiastic, perhaps, in their work. So let's have a think about houses now. We're still not really at a period where there's any surviving of this age in the Isle, but just to give some context as to what's happening in the surrounding area. The South Kine Tower, that's this one here, is the only surviving part of a manor house built by Gilbert d'Umfraville in 1338. So this is getting into the 14th century. And you'll see there's got slightly pointed arches to the windows, so it's more of a Gothic practice. And we see this in a few other places, such as Lincoln Cathedral at the time. This would have formed part of a high status house. These are largely defensive structures up till the 13th century. And it's also the time period where we're seeing castles. The key, if I can bring it up here, would have been the Great Hall, which is this area here in the layout. This wasn't a hall as we see halls today. This was a communal area for living, sleeping, and eating. The central hearth, just here, would have kept the area warm, but it also would have been used as a formal meeting place as well. Now, this change in house design also reflects a change in society at the time. So if you remember when we were looking at Boothby Manor, that was a high status building that featured animal and storage underneath, and then some fine living quarters above. Now, of course, this is a very, very different layout. And this is because there's less of a need for defence. And so you have got this much wider and harder to defend structure instead. And it means that you can start seeing divisions in the social strata. So accommodation is now separated and used to reflect the status of the inhabitant. So over here, we've got parlours, and we've got the kitchen passage and the pantry and the fireplace. We've got lots of different rooms, and so people can start to be spread out. Now, this example here is of Tattershall Castle. Now, although this one might look defensive, if you have a close look, you'll see once again, we have wide doors, wide windows. It's not actually defensive as it looks. It is more like a a status symbol, this one. Now, this one is also significant because it is entirely built in brick. Now, whilst today brick is seen as perhaps the most common of building materials, back then it was actually expensive. Each brick had to be made for you. And so this was, more than anything, it was a status symbol. It was a display of wealth and power. Now, this is another good example here of a very, very distinctive building. Now, these Tudor buildings are found between 1485 and 1560. They are timber-framed buildings, as can be seen by the very, very distinctive timbers that can be seen on the outside of the building. And in urban environments, these are timber-framed buildings and they are on top of the brick or stone foundations. And they're a good use of small space. Often there was a shop on the lower floor, so this would have been more of a public space, and there would have been accommodation above. Now, this represents merchant accommodation effectively. It's business and life together. So you have your shop down here and you're living above it. It is a higher status building, once again, showing someone has the wealth to provide for themselves and their family in this way. Now, this example is Doddington Hall. So this is this was built between 1593 and 1600. It is a late Elizabeth example and a lot of what we would call Jacobean in feature. So it has these distinctive 4 windows, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you'll see that's repeated throughout. And it does have a roof. If you look at it, it doesn't look like it does, but it does have a roof, but this is hidden beneath this parapet here. And that's quite Elizabethan. It's quite in style. And in this period, we do see a massive increase in the number of windows that great houses have. So once again, you could almost see through this building, it feels like there are so many windows in it. So this is moving again away from defensiveness and towards displays of comfort and wealth. But we do still have these square turrets and domed roofs. And that's more what we call the Jacobean features in it. So once again, architectural periods are helpful, but it's no cut and dried. They do flow into each other. People use bits of of different periods according to what is stylish and fashionable at the time. So don't get too weighed down with saying this is Jacobean, this is Elizabethan. We are seeing bits of everything within that. Now, bringing it a bit closer to the Isle, we have Crow. Now, this is from 1664, even though perhaps to the untrained eye, it looks a lot more modern. And this is because it's had a lot of restoration completed on it. And we do see a few more of the more modern features, such as these early sash windows. You can see these windows here have been divided, whereas these are sash. And we get the use of dormer windows as well. So moving on in time a little bit more again. So that's how the rich and powerful are living. But how are we, the ordinary people, how are we living? Well, this is as far as we've got. From the later 14th century onwards, we now have, wait for it, 2 rooms to live in. So hall, parlour. And this is from a traditional kind of mud and stud building. Sometimes, if you're really lucky, you're going to get some attic space for storage and or sleeping. So life perhaps for the ordinary person hasn't changed that much while I've been seeing all these developments in these richer buildings. Having these half-hipped roofs as well allows for this half-story upstairs. So you can see here they've got the window showing that they've got a little bit of space upstairs as well. And this here is an example of a mud and stud, even not mud and spud. And this style of living for most people continues up to around the 18th or 19th century. This is actually an 18th century example, which is from near Spilsby, and is actually one that HTL owns. So that's the Heritage Trust of Lincolnshire owns. And we rent it out as holiday accommodation or as long-term lets. And this features a baffle entry. So it's coming in here, and you'll notice the fireplaces are in the middle of the house, which helps to heat the entire house rather than losing the heat out the side. And once again, bringing this back to the Isle of Axholme, you'll see entrance in the middle, fireplaces in the middle as well. So if you go into this house, the hearth will be just off of one side of the doorway with 3 rooms in total. And normally only 1 room would be heated. Now this can develop over time. You'll see that this building has an additional chimney. And originally this house probably would have been thatched. This roof probably would have been replaced in the Victorian period, because we have this much skinnier 19th century chimney at the end, which gives more heating. And so that's a few different periods we've just gone through there. So I think it's probably time for a break. So if you want to take a moment to just step away from the screen, get yourself a drink, please do take it now. Okay, and welcome back to Architecture on the Isle. So we're now going to have a look at a few themes of different aspects that I want to discuss. And the first of that is bricks. So as a general rule, bricks increase in size from the medieval period to the 19th century, and then they start to decrease in size again until we get our standard metric brick introduced in the 20th century. Now, I was saying earlier when we looked at Tattershall Castle that brick originally was an expensive building material, and this is in part due to the brick taxes, which were introduced around 1784. However, despite that, it was still a popular building material to use. If you could, you would use it. Now, solid 9-inch walls were the norm at this point. And so bonding materials would have been needed to really bond the bricks together and to keep them tight. Now, most often, we'll see this bond here, you see it's got a nice yellowy colour to it. This would have been lime mortar. And lime mortar is a fantastic material because it creates a permeable, flexible material that allows the building to breathe and move. Now, allowing a building to move might seem perhaps counterintuitive to today's standards, but these buildings needed to be able to let moisture out to make sure the bricks didn't degrade. So what would happen is that any excess moisture in the house would be absorbed by the walls through the atmosphere, and then because lime mortar is more permeable, it would come out through the lime mortar. If you have a bond that's too strong and it is less permeable than the brick, the water will instead come out of the brick, and then this causes this form of degradation. Really, you want the lime mortar to be worn away, and because that is pretty easy then to replace your lime mortar with the bricks. If your bricks start to wear away, you have to replace the entire wall. So much bigger job, a much more expensive job as well. Now, these examples are from the 18th and 19th century, both found in the Isle of Axholme. Now, this map here shows the extent of brick and tile works in the county. Now, this map is also from an historical atlas of Lincolnshire, I should point out. And we do start to see an increase in brick and tile works. But even up to the early Victorian period, brickies still fired some bricks directly on the site where they were working and where they were building. So it isn't a full picture, but you can see even in the Isle of Axholme, people are making bricks here for sale. And so we actually get different fashions of different ways the bricks are put together. And the pattern that the bricks are put together in is called the bond. So this picture here is an English bond. It is full rows of stretchers and headers. So a stretcher is the long side of the brick and headers are these smaller bricks here. So you've got a full row of stretchers and a full row of headers, and then it repeats on and on and on. And this style is popular up until the 17th century. Then we get Flemish bond, and this is stretcher header alternative. So you get a stretcher, then a header, then a stretcher, then a header, then a stretcher, so on, so on, so on. Now, in the 18th century, the English garden wool is quite popular. And this is 3 rows of stretchers, see 1, 2, 3, and then 1 row of headers. You do see lots of this bond, particularly in the north and the east, including on the Isle of Axholme. And this version was used in the 19th century. It's called rat wrap. It's a very cheap version, and it's achieved by laying bricks on their edge, so the wool is much thinner. And of course, the other form that you might see is just simply an irregular bond. Early walls didn't often have any pattern at all. So if you are looking at a building and you want to try dating it and you can't do that from the architectural style alone, sometimes looking at the brick bonds can help give you a date. So for example, there's an English bond, up until the 17th century, Flemish bond, 17th century, English garden wool, 18th century. That's going to help you nail down the date of a particular building. Now, one form of architecture I also want to have a quick look at is farmsteads, because this is a building that is found all over the Isle, and so really is worth a mention. So this is just a basic example of a farmstead here, and the thing with farmsteads we have to remember is that they are functional buildings. And so you'll notice here that all these lines, it's all based around how people are using the area. So entrances are facing perhaps the fields to get directly, the manure straight to the fields. Your crops and your animals going to market perhaps go directly onto a road. It's a very functional space. Now, this is a lovely example of a farm building. I think this one we saw in Belton. Now, there are lots and lots of these on the Isle, and they might be older than you suspect. They're really interesting buildings. We actually found some examples of pre the 19th century. Most tend to be in a fairly loose courtyard shape. So you've got, the buildings surrounding this central outside working area here. They are made of brick with pan-tile roofs. Now, you can just see in this picture here that there is a diamond-shaped hole in the walls, and this means that this building here is a threshing barn. And this is because lots of air is needed in the threshing process. Sometimes you'll see these patterns in the wall, but they'll have been blocked up. And this is because they may have been later developed into combination barns or storage barns. And of course, if you're storing grain in a barn, in that case, you don't want the fresh air and all the rain and the moisture coming in. Often they might have stables attached to them. It looks like this, at least at one point in its lifetime, has had a stable attached to it as well. So the bricks from the last slide, let's pop that. There we go. This one here, that is actually a picture from that building there. And so we suspect that this building is going to be of 18th century around. And often if you're interested in buildings, you can just pop onto the listed buildings site on Historic England and try and find it. And we did that for this one, and that seems to confirm that this is an 18th century barn. So once again, there's a lot of these on the Isle, so I've got a few photos of them. This barn's bricks looks like they're more from the 19th century. You can see they're not quite as degraded, even though, of course, the roof is in much worse condition up there. You'll notice these really wide doorways. Now, this is important because it gives you the access for, large carts, large vehicles to transport materials. But once again, these diamond patterns indicating this was originally at least a threshing barn. And this example here is would have been a stable yard. Of course, someone's parking their car in it now, but it would have been stable yards and cart sheds. And so once again, the building is thin, lots and lots of doors. The width of these doors would have been determined by the size of horses that are being used. So once again, the function of the building is very much governing what it looks like, which makes farm buildings a really easy place to start in a way, because there's so many different shapes and sizes according to all the different jobs on a farm. And so it's a really good way to kind of get your eye in to identify all these differences. This example, I should point out though, is from the Wolds and not the Isle of Axholme. And over here, we have an example of a horse engine, and this is actually in the Humberhead levels. So the building here I'm talking about is this circular building. It's from the late 18th century, and it was used for mechanical threshing. So this makes sense here, because even just looking on this fairly close-up photo, you can see lots of arable farming taking place. So the next area we're going to look at are windows. Now, windows can be described as the eyes of the building. So in the medieval period, these would have been open gaps, sometimes with shutters to keep the weather out. Glazing was not as common an industry, and of course it would have been for the rich, even if you did have it. Let's just get all the pictures up. Oh, too far. There we go. So mullioned windows, which can be seen in stone or wood, are often from the 17th century or older, because from around the mid 17th to 18th century, we get sash windows. So that's this is a much more modern example, but that's this style here and this style here. Now, in older windows as well, you get these smaller panes of glass. This is just due to the technology of the time not being able to make these bigger panes. Generally speaking, the older a window you've got, the more wibbly wobbly it is. So the more gaps you're going to have that are letting in air and moisture, and perhaps you might hear it in the wind as well. Of course, today we really like plastic windows. They are, of course, great for keeping our houses warm and keeping out drafts. They don't look great on historic buildings quite so much because, of course, they're just not fitting with the time period as well. And so we're moving slowly into the era of the Georgians. And let's have a look back to our grand modern buildings. We're getting back to grand museum buildings, in particular in London, you see this. And of course, this is the British Museum here. So we're about to enter the time perhaps of even more lavish architecture. So one of the distinctive things about the Georgian period is actually there were very, very few purpose-built churches built. So of course, up to this point, I've been talking so much about the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans, and then moving on to the early English and how they've been building on and expanding these churches. Whereas in the Georgian period, we don't see as many purpose-built churches. And so they actually start to appear perhaps in different shapes and sizes as buildings perhaps being adapted instead. And as you can see here, we're getting more pubs that survive from this period as well. So no longer is it just churches and grand buildings. We're still starting to see more kind of perhaps everyday buildings being remaining in our villages today. So this example, the White Hart from Crowell, we think it's from around the 16th to 17th century, and it would have been remodeled in the early 17th to 18th century. It has a timber frame and it's been encased and rebuilt in brick. So we can't really see so much what was going on in the earlier period. And it's been rough rendered as well. And this is just showing the local materials. Once again, timber, good, easily available local material. Of course, as we move on, being rebuilt in brick, we saw those brick kilns, they are around in the area. Georgian houses have their own look and their own feel to them as well. The Georgian period was a period that was a big fan of symmetry. And so they have lovely large wooden windows, pedmented doors. So you can see here, you know, large windows, pedmented doors, lovely symmetry happening here, quite pleasing to the eye. And this is when we really start to see a lot more buildings surviving on the Isle of Axholme. And this is generally because more bricks are being produced and more people are able to build their houses in this much more durable material rather than mud and stud, rather than timber. And so we get more things surviving. And we do also start to see some variation in roofs at this period as well. So having these valley roofs, for example, means that you can keep the roof flatter, as is the fashion at the time, or you have these parapets which hide the roofs as well. So having this nice, flat, neat roof is quite common. There we go. Now this example here is Temple Bellwood and the Bellwood estate. Now this building was refaced in around 1787 and then the wings were added, so these ones here, which gives it a very Georgian appearance. So it was kind of being restored in a very Georgian style. So you'll see the windows, once again, they're big, they're large, there's symmetry, the roofs are hipped to keep them lower. It became a boarding house in the early 20th century, and unfortunately this one no longer exists because it is now under the M180. Now this almost certainly would not have existed in isolation, and that's another important thing to remember. It would have had a full estate village surrounding it. And these would have been an extension of the show of wealth and would have grown naturally at first as workers came to work in and live on the estate. But during the 19th century in particular, they were often redesigned and added to. So Appleby in North Lincolnshire is an example. So Appleby Hall is actually no longer there. They had an outbreak of typhoid in the 1870s, which they linked to the living conditions. And so they pulled down many of the mud and stud thatched cottages and they rebuilt them in stone, which is a lovely example of architecture at that period. So these are examples of estate cottages here. I think these are from Belton near Grantham, and not the Belton in the Isle of Axholme. So stone built slate roofs, and they're all dated from around the 19th century or 18th with some remodeling in the 19th. And that's Belton House. That's the big estate that these buildings would have been surrounding and serving. So when we compare these, this, of course, is on a completely different scale. It's much more grand, much larger, but the materials are all the same. So you've got the same style, once again, big windows, symmetrically spaced out. You've got the same stone being used. And these are, of course, in limestone because they are on this limestone ridge. And the same roofing material. And even look at the chimneys. The chimneys are all similar as well. So they're on a different scale, but they're clearly all part of the same set in a way. Once again, bringing this back up to the Isle of Axholme, we have Sandhul Lodge Cottage. Now this is just near Crowell. It is a gate lodge cottage, so it would have been at the entrance to an estate area. and it is hexagonal in plan, which we do see sometimes as well. Now, this is where, once again, we can sometimes get a little bit caught up by the over-enthusiastic Victorians, because the Victorians, they did like to hark back to earlier periods. And so they really encouraged a Gothic revival and a Tudor revival in how they like to build things. And so as we move from the Georgians to the Victorians, we start to see the large chimneys again. We start to see casement windows again. And so they weren't grand, but they also like to echo these older periods. Now, this is an early Victorian grand house. We can see a nice bay window. Now, that is distinctively Victorian, having these bay windows. And is actually the rectory in Haxley, I believe, this one. However, despite this being Victorian, the windows, you'll notice, they look very Georgian. You know, very symmetrical, very large, having these smaller panes within them. But if we check the listing, it does actually tell us it's 1840s, so early Victorian. And once again, you have a slate roof, and that does tend to be from a later period than the Georgians, particularly because this slate is Welsh slate. And we have to wait until we get the railways in place for this material to be transported across the country. So once again, it looks Georgian, but there are a few clues here that are telling us it's actually early Victorian. Now, this one's a bit more difficult, I have to say. It's likely Victorian, Georgian or early Victorian, particularly in relation to the brickwork. And so that bond pattern, you can't really see it here. And the proportion of the window openings, you know, big, large, symmetrical. There is a hipped roof, which means that it looks very symmetrical. Whichever way you look at it, you've still got the roof sloping up. Whereas this one looks more Victorian. So you'll notice the brickwork, compare the two, is a lot more regular and crisp in this one. And the window openings look 19th century in proportion. So they're more square in a way. However, I will note that these ones have been replaced with plastic, so they're not the original roofs, and big slate roof at the top. You'll notice this one is pan tiles. So a few other clues there as to date. And this one is clearly a Victorian house. So these windows, you'll notice much, much bigger panes of glass. The chimneys are getting thinner as technology moves on. And we're starting to see a little bit of decorative brickwork, not so much in this one. It's also perhaps a little bit more utilitarian. So the rainwater goods, that's the guttering here, it's painted and visible. And at this time, we start seeing internal toilets as well. So big, big excitement there. And once again, the availability of brickwork is having a jump, which means there's more housing or more brickwork housing available for a wider range of people. Now, this one does still have pan tiles rather than the slate roofing I was talking about, but this is probably because it is an individual farmstead, so it's still using locally produced materials. In the Victorian period, we also start to see terraces very popular. So fully terraced houses, semi-terraced houses, they do tend to be of the Victorian period. We also see these recessed porches as well. Bay windows, and of course these much wider panes of glass. So all of these are giveaways that this is a Victorian period building. We do start to see decorative brickwork, so you can see around here a little bit of decoration, and notice how we're going back to that rounded archway right back from the Norman period there. So a little bit of repetition happening. We also start to see uniformity, and this is coming from the terraced houses. Think of these big rows of terraced houses going down. They look very, very similar. This is really the beginning of mass building programs. And this is because we are suddenly dealing with people who are moving to towns. It's the Industrial Revolution. We need to house them. We need to build their houses. And of course, it's easier just to build a lot in the same style than it is to build individual houses for individual people. So these are examples from Lincoln, and they're being derived really from moving people into cities for factory work. They're quite simple decoration at eye level. We've got this dog tooth thing here. There we go. And part of this is due to the fact, once again, we've got lots of people who are working in factories, we need to build them houses. But there is also a little bit of Victorian craftsmanship and pride. There is starting to be a desire by the developers to show they were looking after their workers in the factory and to show that the houses they were creating had saleability, which is why, although they are utilitarian, they have these slight bits of decoration on as well. And they're fairly well made. I mean, think of how many of these houses are still standing in towns today. They're a core feature of our towns and cities. Now, the King's Arms is a nice example of how a building can develop over time. So you'll notice the front is very, very Victorian looking, big wide windows going back to that arched doorway, nicely spaced out. However, it also has a carriage arch to one side that's been added, which would have been to take drinkers home. And of course, now it is a notice board. If we look at the side view, this back wing would likely have been added much later. And we have a conservatory. Of course, that is much more recent again. So once again, buildings don't just get created and then exist. They are adapted to suit the needs of the people who are living in them continually and throughout time. And so we move into the 20th century. Some notable buildings from the Isle of Axholme include this Methodist church, which is a listed building, which is in Haxing. Now, if we compare the Methodist churches to the C of E, we'll see they're much more formal and austere. They don't quite have the same grandeur, but they're still well detailed. We have detailing in the windows here. And would you look at that? We've got arches happening again. So once again, we do like to hark back to perhaps earlier architectural detailing as well. And then we have this brick decoration at the top, which is slightly like early Art Deco. And once again, we'll notice these bricks are looking really firm, really crisp, and that's because they're no longer being handmade. They're all machine cut and industrially fired. So they're becoming a lot more standardized. Oaston Ferry Coronation Hall is another example. This was built in 1912 as a charity formed as reading rooms, as a use for local people. As it's being designed as a local amenity, it has lots of civic architecture. So it's combining the need for utility, so all these different rooms, different shapes and sizes that people can use for different purposes, with a desire to show investment in the community. So there's a little bit of decoration just to show that they're putting the effort in. So you've got these archways over the windows here, just to make it an interesting building. Perhaps a more grand example is the Usher Gallery, and this is back in Lincoln now. Now, this was opened in 1927, and you'll note it being designed as a gallery, being designed as a museum space. It echoes back perhaps to the British Museum. So it's taking some design features from there in the columns you can see coming down here. It's being influenced by that, but not quite on as the same large and grand scale as we see in London. Now, these windows here are what we call sun trap windows, and they were a very fashionable 1930s style. However, I will note here, we don't see them in Lincolnshire that much at all. And often when people try to put in new windows for them, they're often wrecked they don't really suit our modern way of we do windows these days. And once again, we have a mix of different building materials and styles here. This is actually the old library museum from Worksop in the 1930s. So we're going off aisle again, just to give you a good example. It is a mix of very, very classical architecture. So columns, we've got these thinner divided windows. but it's mixed with modern architectural detailing, like the domed roof, and these windows are actually metal windows as well. So modern materials and styles are being used, but it's still a link back to the old craftsmanship and styling for grandeur as well. But the charm of the vernacular still exists. So I'd imagine this is probably an inter or just post-war building, and it's probably using materials from elsewhere. So we do still get these simpler forms as well. Now, this is actually a 1960s development from the University of East Anglia. They were nicknamed the Ziggurats, hopefully I can see why, after the Aztec temples, and comes from the idea of communal university living. So this is another new architecture we're having to deal with. Students, of course, are coming across in large numbers, and they need to live somewhere. Now, this is following the almost brutalist concrete building style. Now, actually, the brutalist style does really well on the continent, but it's not always appreciated in the UK, which is why a lot of these buildings perhaps aren't seen with the same fondness as we see some of our older, our Tudor style buildings and the like. And so we're pretty much getting up to the modern day now. And we're seeing this pattern of integrating new architecture with old architecture, this mix of the grandeur and the modern materials. It's all coming into play in the modern day as well. So the real question is, what do you think of that? Because these buildings do bring up a lot of different opinions. This is an example of a building here, and you can see the front has got lots of older detailing, but at the back, they have put in a much more modern style of window. What do you think of that? Does that work for you? Does it not? It may sway your opinion to know that they've been using very, very traditional joints. So I think this is one that was replaced, and they've put in the same jointing system there to really respond to and reflect the historic character of the building, whilst making it suitable for modern living. In modern living, we like lots of light in our buildings. They're becoming, if you think of these big panes of windows in buildings, they're becoming more and more common. So they can be divisive, but all throughout history, if you think of all the periods we looked at so far, it's buildings being adapted to the style of living at the time. At one point they were defensive, then there was no need for that, so it became displays of wealth. We are always going to be using buildings to display who we are as a society and what we're really kind of focusing on as well. So this is an example from Sleaford, and you can see this older church has had this rather modern add-on. Now, I must admit, I'm not as keen on this one, although they have tried to reflect some of the principles. So these very, very evenly spaced windows are kind of repeated here. This big window, which is pretty much covered up, unfortunately, by the brick, is repeated in the shape of the doorway here. So they have tried to echo some of the shapes. Of course, they've used different materials. The brick is very distinctively not part of the original church. Now, some people might say that this is completely out of keeping, but others would say it's important to show what is the old and what is the new. So we're not perhaps tricking you into thinking that an entire building is from an older period. Like I said, I think this one could have been done more sympathetically, but they have at least tried to bring in some of the elements. This is perhaps a more famous example. It's the British Museum. So on the outside, very, very classical architecture, very grand. Inside, very, very modern. Once again, lots of light, lots of white, lots of space. How do they work together as a building? Generally, this is regarded as a really good mix of the old and new, and you can see the older buildings facing the courtyard there. But what's your opinion on it? This is an example from Lincoln, and this is a building that is entirely new, but it has been built in a very, very old area. That's actually Lincoln Cathedral, you can see just there. Sometimes it's not just about the building, but how it fits within the landscape. Would you say that fits within that landscape? Now, this one is actually one that I really like. So this is a Norwich Cathedral refractory, and it featured a partial rebuild of the existing wall. So you can see the line in the stone wall here, where the rebuild continued on from. And then they inserted a wooden and glass building into the space where the refractory was. So turning this open space into an indoor area. Now, first of all, I think this has been done really sympathetically. You can still see the original wall, but you can also see what's new, and they're not detracting from each other. The cathedral had a need to have space for more visitors. And so what they've done is they've turned the old refectory into the cafe space, which I think is fantastic as well, because this area is being used for the same thing in a way. And so as people are wandering around the cathedral, they really get a sense of how the space would have been laid out. It would have been like to be there in historic periods. So what do you think of that one? Do you like how it's been done? Do you like how they've used the different materials? Now, this is Castello di Mantera, and what they've done, that's come out really poorly, that image, I'm sorry, but we can see from this image, is they've kept in all the original brickwork and then almost inserted this concrete into the middle to show the original shape of it. This one is perhaps a little bit more divisive, but it does show the original shape without taking away what has survived or doing replicas. It's a much more perhaps authentic image of what would have been there. And this is my favourite example at all, although this one, I must admit, has divided people in the office. This is Greystoke Castle and Blanco Hall. So the earliest remains on site are from the 12th century. So a very, very, very historic building. And it would have been completely out of use. You can see it's got this massive gap in it. You can't live in a space like that. But the family have brought the tower back into use by essentially dropping in this glass and steel box inside the tower. What do you think of it? I actually really like it, I have to admit. Is it good to leave the broken bit in the middle, or should they have repaired it, or should they have left it saying this is an unlivable structure, but it's important for our history? Now, if you also think of the size of the windows, if they had just restored this and they wanted to live in it, where would the light come from? As we were talking earlier, today we really like having these big windows and lots of natural light. So if they did that, it perhaps wouldn't be as suitable for modern day living. Now, what I really like about it is the history. Now, this gash was actually created due to damage from a siege of the building during the Civil War. So I personally think that if they had repaired or restored this bit of the wall to bring the castle back into use, they would have been taking away an important piece of history. This gash is telling the story of the Civil War and of how different people were fighting, brothers and sisters were fighting each other to determine the political future of our country. By dropping this box in, they leave this lovely history in place. So having that history in the gash, does that change of what you think of it, or what you would do to it if you were lucky enough to own this castle and have enough money to bring it back into use? Do you like how it looks? Like I said, personally, I do, but this one has caused a lot of division in the office, I do believe. So feel free to come to your own conclusion. And so that brings us to an end to architecture on the Isle. Now, like I said before, this is just an introduction. I have very, very briefly skimmed over a lot of different periods, a lot of different themes here. So if this has piqued your interest, I do encourage you to investigate further and go deeper into the subject. Obviously, we have strayed off the Isle quite a lot during the course of this presentation, but I did want to make sure you had an idea of what was happening generally and how the Isle of Axholme architecture fitted into it. But just to recap, the Isle of Axholme architecture is mainly looking at churches to begin with, because they were the only buildings that were being built with stone. And then we also get some manor buildings, perhaps for the richer as we go on through time, and farm buildings. Farm buildings really show how the ordinary person was living at the time, how money was being made, how people were working. And so I personally think the farm buildings are the most interesting of all the ones on the Isle. But please do have a walk around some villages, really see what you can spot. Look at the shapes of doorways and of windows, look at how the brick's been put together, and use that to tell a story of what has been happening in that town or village. Now, of course, at the end, we really do have to thank the Isle of Axholme and Hatfield Chase Landscape Partnership for commissioning this work, and North Lincolnshire Council for organising it. A big thank you to all of you who are listening to this, who play the lottery, because of course it is the National Lottery Heritage Fund who are funding this work, and the rest of the work that is contributed to the Isle of Axholme and Hatfield Chase. If you want to see more of our digital courses looking on themes such as archaeology, farming, and documentary research, they are all being hosted on the same page where you access this, the Isle of Axholme and Hatfield Chase Landscape Partnership website, where there are also more information about the reports and other archaeological work we've been completing as part of the project. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you learned something through this talk. Thank you very much.